They said family always comes first. But I learned that in our house, family meant whoever looked best on camera. The day my parents skipped my wedding for my sister's high society gala, I stayed quiet. No fight, no tears. Then the photos from Santorini hit the news. Me, barefoot under the sunset, saying I do, while they smiled for headlines. A week later, the same press they chased exposed them. And that's when silence became my sharpest weapon. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. They said family always comes first. But I learned that in our house, family meant whoever looked best on camera. The day my parents skipped my wedding for my sister's high society gala, I stayed quiet. No fight, no tears. Then the photos from Santorini hit the news. Me, barefoot under the sunset, saying I do, while they smiled for headlines. A week later, the same press they chased exposed them. And that's when silence became my sharpest weapon. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The house I grew up in stood on a quiet, tree-lined street in Beacon Hill, the kind of neighborhood that looked like it belonged in a coffee table book about Boston's elegance. From the outside, it was beautiful. White columns, brick facade, ivy curling up toward the second floor. Inside it gleamed like a museum. The marble floors always shined, the portraits were perfectly aligned, and every shelf held a framed article about my father's real estate empire. My father, Richard Pierce, was a man who believed in control. Control over his image, his deals, and most of all, his family. He used to tell me, perfection isn't a goal, Lauren. It's the minimum. I was 10 when I first realized that being his daughter was less about being loved and more about being polished. My mother, Margaret, floated through the house like a socialite ghost, always preparing for something. Charity luncheons, benefit auctions, dinners where people pretended to care about other people. That afternoon, she was pacing through the dining room, fixing the tablecloth for a local fundraiser she was hosting. "Lauren, dear, straighten your collar," she said without looking up. "And watch how your sister holds her shoulders. Posture is everything in photographs. Olivia." My 6-year-old sister sat in the living room, a photographer crouched in front of her. The flash popped every few seconds. She smiled with perfect dimples, the kind of smile that made adults melt. My mother beamed with pride, whispering to the photographer, "She's a natural, isn't she?" I stood in the hallway, clutching the corner of the doorframe. Nobody noticed me. The air smelled like lilies and lemon polish, and the house felt like a stage where I had no lines. Later that evening, we had dinner. The table was long enough to fit 10 people, though it was just the 4 of us. The silverware sparkled under the chandelier. My father talked about a new property deal in the Back Bay, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to being quoted. "We'll close by the end of the quarter," he said, slicing into his steak. My mother nodded in rhythm, offering polite affirmations like she was part of his press team. Olivia, sitting between them, announced proudly, "My painting was chosen for the children's exhibit at the museum." My father smiled wide. "That's my girl. The Pierces have talent." He raised his glass to her. "To art and to being extraordinary." I cleared my throat softly. "I got first place in the regional science fair today. My project on ocean filtration." He interrupted, waving his hand as if batting away a fly. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Maybe you can make a presentation at one of the school fundraisers next year. Margaret reminded me to speak to the board." His voice had already shifted back to business. My mother was checking her watch. "Richard, the Petersons are expecting us at 8. We shouldn't be late." The room went silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Olivia hummed a tune under her breath, swinging her legs. I looked at my plate at the reflection of the chandelier in the silver knife. My father never noticed how small that reflection made me look. When I was little, I thought family dinners meant being together. In our house, it meant performing, smiling when the conversation drifted past you, laughing when you didn't understand the joke, pretending that the quiet didn't sting. "Lauren," my mother said, glancing up, "you should smile more. It softens your face." I forced one smile and practiced. "Sure, Mom." My father poured himself another glass of wine, then raised it. To the Pierces, he declared, the ice clinking softly, "This family was born to be noticed." The glasses met in the air, a perfect synchronized toast. I lifted mine, feeling the cold stem between my fingers, watching the light flicker through the red liquid. As they drank, I looked around the table. The chandelier, the crystal, the reflections that caught only surfaces. I didn't say it out loud, but the words lived in my throat. Being noticed isn't the same as being seen. I set my glass down carefully, the sound barely audible, and let the silence hang in the air. The glow from my laptop was the only light in the room. It was past midnight, and the dorms at Harvard Business School were silent except for the low hum of the radiator. I had been refreshing my email for an hour, waiting for something. Anything. Then it appeared. Congratulations, you've been accepted into the MBA program at Harvard Business School. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Then the words blurred. I pressed my hand against my mouth, trying not to cry too loudly. This was it. The first thing I'd earned that nobody could say came from my father's name. I grabbed my phone and called home. My mother answered on the third ring. "Lauren, it's late. Is everything all right?" I got in. I said breathless. "Harvard Business School. Mom, Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful," she interrupted, her voice bright but distracted. "You know, it's funny. Your sister just got invited to display her paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts next month. Isn't that incredible? The curator said she has real talent." I swallowed, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "That's great, Mom. I just wanted to share the news." "Of course, darling. We're so proud of both of you." Then, like a reflex, she added, "Make sure you send your father the official letter. He likes to keep those things for the press." When the call ended, the silence felt heavier. I stared at the blinking cursor on the email, then at the photo of my parents on my desk, smiling in front of one of my father's new developments. The same smile they wore for every camera. The next day, Olivia called. "Hey, superstar," she teased. "Mom says you're going to Harvard." "Yeah," I said. "I start in the fall." "Congrats." "Maybe Dad will finally stop using me as the family's creative mascot." Her laugh was easy, unbothered. "Anyway, they're taking me to Mistral tonight to celebrate my exhibit. You should come if you're in town." "I'm not," I said, "but have fun." That night I ate alone in the dining hall, pushing cold pasta around my plate while a group of classmates celebrated nearby. In my head, I could hear the clinking of glasses at the Pierce dinner table. The same rhythm, a different song. When the semester began, I poured everything into my studies. Case studies, presentations, late nights at the library. I lived on caffeine and ambition. My classmates were brilliant and loud, all desperate to be noticed. I stayed quiet, but sharp, learning fast. There was power in silence when you knew what you were doing. I remember one evening after class, a professor stopped me in the hallway. "Ms. Pierce, your analysis of the biotech merger was impressive. Have you considered consulting?" I smiled. I'd rather build something of my own. He looked surprised, then nodded. "Then make sure you build it so well that nobody can ignore it." Those words stayed with me. The years blurred into a rhythm of work and winter. I interned at a healthcare startup in Cambridge, spending long hours watching how ideas became products and how people in charge took credit for them. I told myself I'd never be that kind of leader. By 2012, I was working full-time for a medical data company in Boston. My apartment overlooked the Charles River, and every morning I'd run along the esplanade watching the sun rise over the water. The skyline always looked like it was holding its breath. I understood the feeling. My parents called occasionally, mostly when they needed me to attend a family event or pose for a picture. At one gala, my father pulled me aside, smiling for the photographers. "You're doing well, right? Keep the Pierce name strong. That's all that matters." I wanted to tell him that I didn't need the name, that I was building something on my own, but I just nodded and let him have his photo. The following spring, I stood in the courtyard at my graduation ceremony holding my cap and watching families take pictures under the blooming magnolias. My father was shaking hands with a board member from the hospital foundation. I heard him laugh and say, "Lauren's smart, always has been, but Olivia, she's the real star of the family. She has that spark." It didn't hurt the way I expected. It just hollowed out something I'd stopped trying to fill. After the ceremony, I skipped the dinner reservation and walked toward the Charles. The wind was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of the river and the distant echo of traffic. I leaned against the railing, the city lights flickering across the water. All my life I'd been trying to shine in a house already full of mirrors. But that night I decided I didn't need their reflection. I would find my own light, even if it meant walking away from everything that glittered. The sky over Boston faded from gold to deep blue, and for the first time I felt free enough to breathe. By 2015, Los Angeles had already taught me how to work until the city lights blurred into one continuous glow outside my window. My apartment was small, 2 rooms and a balcony that overlooked a gas station, but it was enough. On my desk sat 3 empty coffee mugs, a dying plant, and a laptop that never slept. Rachel Moore, My best friend from grad school called it the birthplace of Vital Track. We started with nothing but an idea, a cloud system that tracked hospital supplies to prevent shortages. It sounded simple, but simple ideas are the hardest to make real. Most nights I coded until my hands ached, my eyes burned, and the room felt smaller. I whispered to myself, "We don't have investors. We don't have connections. But we have time. And that's still something." Rachel worked from the couch, surrounded by piles of spreadsheets. If one more investor tells us they love the concept, but can't commit, she said one night, "I'm going to lose it." "They'll call back," I told her, even though I didn't believe it. "Maybe they're just scared we'll actually make it work." She laughed, tossing me a protein bar. "Keep that optimism. It looks good on you." We lived off takeout noodles and caffeine. Our first demo crashed 3 times during a hospital presentation. When the chief of operations walked out, I sat on the curb outside, humiliated. Rachel joined me, holding 2 warm sodas. "It's not over," she said. "They'll need us one day." Her faith carried me when my own ran out. Weeks turned into months. Rejections piled up, but so did the code lines. Every error fixed felt like a step closer to something that mattered. And then, one afternoon, while testing the latest build, I got an email from St. Francis Medical Center in San Francisco. They wanted a full trial. I read it 3 times before I screamed. Rachel burst in thinking something was wrong. "What happened?" They said yes, I said, showing her the email. "We got our first client." She stared at it, then screamed louder than I did. We jumped up and down in the middle of the room like kids. She pulled out a dusty bottle of cheap champagne we'd bought months earlier for when the miracle happens. The cork flew across the room, hit the wall, and both of us laughed until our faces hurt. "If your parents could see you right now," Rachel teased, pouring us both half glasses. "What do you think they'd say?" I smiled. "They'd probably ask what I'm wearing." She raised her glass. To us, the underdogs with good posture, the pilot launch was chaotic and exhausting. I barely slept, but when I watched hospital staff scan supplies, and the system worked without errors, I felt something new. Purpose. Not approval, not pride. Just peace. Within a year, 3 more hospitals signed on. Rachel handled the logistics while I focused on code and expansion. Our company had an office now, just a small one downtown, but it was ours. I even bought new chairs that didn't squeak. Then one morning as I walked into the office, Rachel was staring at her phone. "You've seen this?" she asked. On the screen was an article from Forbes, Richard Pierce, Power Broker of the Year. My father's smile was stretched across the page, his hand gripping a crystal award. The caption read, "Pierce Development continues to shape the Boston skyline." I scrolled through the article. My name wasn't there. Not even a passing mention of the daughter who had once written the proposal for the foundation he now funded. Rachel watched my face. "You okay?" Yeah, I lied. I'm used to it. But when she left for a meeting, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook. The last page was blank. I wrote one sentence in the center. "One day they won't be able to ignore the sound of my silence." Outside, the city buzzed with the noise of traffic and sirens. Inside, our little office hummed with the sound of servers' fans and the quiet rhythm of purpose. I turned off the overhead lights and stood by the window. Downtown Los Angeles stretched endlessly, a tangle of lights and movement. I watched it for a long time, feeling both small and unshakably certain. Every light out there was someone's story burning against the dark. I whispered mine's just getting started, and the reflection in the glass didn't look like the forgotten daughter of anyone. It looked like someone finally learning to exist without permission. The restaurant faced the ocean glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling. The kind of place where the air always smelled like salt and champagne. Daniel and I sat by the window, a stack of wedding magazines and a laptop between us. The waves rolled in slow and steady, crashing against the sand like they knew the rhythm of our hesitation. He flipped through a catalog of destination weddings, stopping at a photo of Santorini. White domes, blue roofs, sunlight pouring over the cliffs. This one again, he teased, tracing the edge of the picture. "You really want to get married halfway across the world?" I smiled. "It's not that far. 10 hours by plane, a lifetime away, in spirit." He leaned back, studying me. "So, you're choosing it because it's beautiful or because it's far?" I met his gaze, because no one there knows who the Pierces are. He didn't respond right away. Daniel never pushed when silence had something to say. That was one of the first things I loved about him. He didn't fill the quiet. He let me breathe in it. We spent the next hour comparing venues, beaches, vineyards, mountains, but every time he turned a page, I found myself glancing back at that same photo of Santorini. The water was impossibly blue, the kind of color that could wash away anything heavy. "Let's do it," he said finally. "Santorini." I laughed softly. "You just want an excuse to wear linen." He shrugged. "Maybe. But mostly I want you to have your peace." The following weeks became a blur of planning. Meetings with planners over Zoom floral mood boards, endless decisions about things like napkin textures and table placements. Rachel helped design the invitation's simple ivory cards with gold edges. I tried on dresses with Samantha and Rachel one afternoon at a boutique in Beverly Hills. They gasped at every option, but I couldn't picture myself in any of them until I slipped into one with silk sleeves and a neckline that barely caught the light. When I stepped out, the room went still. Rachel smiled. "That's the one." In the dressing mirror, I saw someone I didn't quite recognize, a woman calm enough to take up space without apologizing for it. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table writing the guest list. Names came easily at first: friends from work, Rachel and Jason, a few college classmates. Then I got to the last two lines: Mom, Dad. My pen hovered over the paper. Daniel walked in, towel around his neck, his hair still wet from the shower. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, though my voice came out thinner than I wanted. "Just finishing the invites." He leaned over my shoulder and saw their names. "You're inviting them?" I nodded. "It's the right thing to do." He hesitated. "Do you think they'll come?" "I don't know." I wrote the words carefully. Richard and Margaret Pierce. Below it, in smaller handwriting: "My love, always. Your daughter, Lauren." When I sealed the envelope, I stared at it for a long time before placing it in the stack. The next morning, I dropped it into the mailbox on my way to the office. Days turned into weeks. Wedding updates arrived in my inbox. Vendor confirmations traveled details a message from the planner about sunset times for perfect photos. Every little piece fell into place, and still there was a quiet ache I couldn't name. One evening, Daniel and I met Rachel and Jason for dinner at the same seaside restaurant. The sunset turned the entire sky into liquid gold. Rachel was talking about her new photography exhibit when Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "I'm fine," I said automatically. He studied me for a moment. "You're not fine. You're thinking about them." I looked out at the horizon. "I just don't want to start my marriage pretending I don't care about the people who made me." He squeezed my hand gently. "You don't owe anyone the version of yourself they refuse to see." The words sank deep, but I still wanted to believe in something softer, that maybe for once my parents would choose family over appearances. A few weeks later, the invitations went out. Rachel texted me a picture of hers sitting in her mailbox with a row of heart emojis. I checked my phone every few hours, half hoping, half dreading a call from Boston. None came. One night, Daniel and I drove down to Malibu and sat on the sand. The tide was high, the water whispering close to our feet. The sun dropped low, painting the waves crimson. He leaned back on his elbows, watching the sky fade to purple. "They'll come," he said quietly, as if saying it could make it true. I wanted to believe him. "Maybe," I said, "maybe this time they'll choose people over pictures." He smiled, but I could see the worry behind it. The ocean wind tangled my hair. I let it stay that way. For the first time, the idea of imperfection felt like freedom. We sat there until the stars came out, the sound of the waves steady, patient, eternal. Nothing like the world I came from, where everything beautiful had to be rehearsed. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds, laying narrow stripes across my desk. The office was quiet, except for the hum of computers and the low buzz of an espresso machine in the break room. I was reviewing contracts for our next hospital client when my phone started vibrating. The caller ID said Dad. I hesitated before picking up. "Hi, Dad," I said. Lauren Richards' voice was crisp, practiced the tone he used when he was about to announce something important. "I'll keep this short. Olivia's been selected to host the Hamilton Polo and Art Gala. It's next month, the 20th. He paused. "That's the same weekend as your wedding, isn't it?" "It is," I said quietly. "Well, we can't miss it." The entire Boston press will be there along with the governor's office, the Hamilton board, and several donors from the hospital foundation. It's a major opportunity for her. And, frankly, for the family. His voice softened just enough to sound polite. You understand, don't you? I gripped the phone tighter. The window beside me reflected his face in my memory. Suit-pressed smile, confident. The same image that always found its way into newspapers. I took a slow breath. Yes, I understand. Good girl, he said, relieved. We'll celebrate when things calm down. Send us pictures from Greece. I will, I said. My voice didn't waver, but something inside me cracked quietly like thin glass under pressure. After he hung up, the office felt too still. Outside, the California light turned amber, catching the edges of the buildings across the street. I stared through the window, my reflection blending with the skyline. They had chosen flashbulbs over sunlight, I thought. Fame over presence. The door opened behind me. Daniel stepped in, sleeves rolled up, holding 2 coffees. Hey, they were out of almond milk, so he stopped when he saw my face. What happened? I turned toward him, managing a half smile. My family's not coming to the wedding. He set the cups down. They said that I nodded. Olivia's hosting some high society gala that weekend. They can't miss it. There'll be photographers. Daniel's jaw tightened. You okay? I'm fine, I said. The lie hung there, obvious but harmless. I guess it's better this way. He moved closer. You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. I met his eyes. I'm not pretending. I've just stopped expecting. He exhaled and touched my shoulder. Then we'll make it the kind of wedding you won't need to remember who didn't show up. After he left, I pulled open my desk drawer and took out the guest list. My pen hovered for a second before pressing down, scratching through 3 names: Richard Pierce, Margaret Pierce, Olivia Pierce. The sound of the ink dragging across paper was sharp final. I tore the page along the creases and folded it twice before slipping it into the trash. At home that night, I gathered the extra invitations, the ones meant for them. I slid their envelopes into a small package and wrote in black ink across the front. For those who choose to show up. The handwriting looked foreign to me, calm and steady. I dropped the envelope in the mail the next morning. When the box closed with a soft, metallic thud, it felt like the sound of a door sealing shut. That evening I drove down to the coast. The beach was empty, just a stretch of dark sand and the rhythmic pull of waves. I kicked off my shoes and walked until the water reached my ankles. The ocean was cool, endless. Above it, the sky was fading to deep violet. My reflection shimmered on the surface. Half light, half shadow. I whispered to it. They'll always choose the camera over me. The words drifted away with the tide, leaving behind only the sound of water and wind. Behind me, Daniel's voice carried over the waves. I thought I'd find you here. He came to stand beside me, holding my jacket. You forgot this. I slipped it on the fabric warm from his hands. Thanks. He looked out at the horizon where the last traces of sunset burned gold. They're not coming, huh? I shook my head. Not this time. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders. Then we'll do it our way. The waves kept rolling in, steady and patient. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I just stood there listening, heart beating in rhythm with the surf, until the city lights behind us disappeared into the dark. Boston was shining that day, or at least pretending to. The Hamilton Polo and Art Gala had turned the countryside estate into a carnival of champagne and money. Helicopters hovered overhead. White tents shimmered like sails on a golden sea of grass. Every guest looked rehearsed. The men in linen suits, the women in pastel gowns, all chasing the same light. Olivia stood in the center of it all, radiant in a custom white dress. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on Ethan Hamilton's arm. Cameras followed her like a tide. Photographers shouted her name as if she were a movie star. I could imagine my father watching proudly from the sidelines, the flash from the bulbs reflecting in his glass of champagne. He was doing what he always did best, working the room. I could picture him shaking hands with a senator, whispering to a developer, smiling for photos that would appear in the Boston Globe by morning. At one point, he slipped an envelope into the hand of a journalist. The cameras caught it, though he didn't seem to notice. The gesture was practiced casual, but to anyone watching closely it said everything. The reporters circled Olivia like moths to a flame. "Miss Pierce, your sister is getting married this weekend." "Isn't she?" One asked, microphone extended. "How does it feel to share the spotlight with her?" Olivia laughed softly. The kind of laugh that filled empty spaces. Lauren's had her share of success. But tonight is about art, about real creation. The Hamilton family has given me an incredible opportunity to represent Boston's creative spirit. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Who's funding the exhibit?" Another voice followed. "Is it true the Hamilton Group received government grants this quarter?" Before Olivia could answer, Richard stepped forward, his tone smooth and commanding. "Let's stay on topic, shall we? Tonight is about culture, not contracts." The crowd chuckled obediently, but tension lingered in the air. A young reporter from an independent outlet stood at the back recording everything. Later, she would review the footage and catch Richard's offhand comment to a board member near the buffet. "As long as the press writes something flattering, the rest will take care of itself." Meanwhile, half a world away, the air in Santorini felt like a different planet. My morning started with the scent of salt and jasmine drifting through the open windows of the villa. Rachel was kneeling beside a table covered in flowers, arranging white peonies and olive branches into vases. I sat cross-legged on the floor, tying small ribbons around bouquets for the ceremony. The sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, scattering patterns across the marble tiles. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. Rachel looked up. "You sure you don't want a makeup artist?" "You're basically doing this wedding on your own." "That's the point," I said. "I want it to feel like us, not like a production." She smiled. "Well, mission accomplished." I caught my reflection in the window. A woman surrounded by light, not cameras. "In Boston, they're performing," I said quietly. "Here, we're just living." Daniel appeared in the doorway, jacket slung over his shoulder. "Everything ready?" "Almost," I said. He crossed the room, standing behind me, resting his hand gently on my shoulder. "You're calm," he said. "That's new." I laughed. "It's the calm before the vows." He bent down, kissing the top of my head. "Whatever happens out there, it's already perfect." When he left, I looked around the room again. The flowers, the sunlight, the quiet hum of waves outside. It wasn't grand, but it was real. The air here didn't ask for performance. It just existed. Rachel snapped a photo of me at the window. "You're glowing," she said. "Good lighting." I answered. "Finally some that isn't artificial." As the afternoon wore on, I stepped out onto the balcony. The cliffs curved along the horizon, the sea stretching into infinity. Below, a sailboat drifted lazily across the water. I thought about the flashbulbs going off in Boston, the laughter echoing across manicured lawns. My voice came out soft but certain. "This light doesn't need an audience." Far away at that same moment, the crowd in Boston cheered as Olivia raised a glass for a toast. The camera flashes were relentless, drowning the night in white bursts of attention. Richard leaned close to a donor, his smile sharp and tired. Then the screen of the young reporter's camera flickered. The image of Richard's hand passing an envelope, the words, "Write something flattering," caught clearly in the microphone. She rewound the clip twice, her eyes widening. On the other side of the world, the sky above Santorini was beginning to change. The gold deepened into amber, then melted into the sea. I stood there until the sun disappeared behind the water, my reflection blending into the horizon. Boston had its lights. I had mine. And for the first time, I didn't need to compete. The sun was already beginning to lower when I stepped onto the terrace. The air shimmered with gold, the kind of light that turns everything it touches into something almost holy. The white horizon villa sat high on the cliff, its walls blindingly white against the cobalt sky. From where I stood, the Aegean stretched endlessly, a sheet of blue glass bending into the horizon. My dress was simple, white satin, no jewels, no veil. The wind caught the fabric and made it ripple around my legs. I could smell the salt in the air, hear the waves far below, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Rachel and Samantha were fussing with the last of the flowers, white peonies and olive branches lining the aisle. Jason tuned a small acoustic guitar, and Adam adjusted the camera. There were no crowds, no photographers shouting our names, only faces that had chosen to be here. Daniel waited for me at the end of the aisle, sunlight catching the edge of his suit. When he saw me, he smiled the way someone does when they finally exhale after holding their breath for too long. My steps were small, deliberate. Each one felt like shedding the last pieces of who I used to be. The girl who tried too hard to be seen. The music started a slow, soft melody, carried by the guitar and the wind. I could hear the sea in the distance blending with the sound of strings. My heart felt quiet, not racing, not trembling, just steady. When I reached him, Daniel took my hands. His palms were warm. "You're shaking," he whispered. I laughed under my breath. "It's the wind." Everyone laughed lightly, and the tension melted into sunlight. Rachel handed me the small card I had written my vows on. My handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged where I had cried the night before, but the words were still clear. I spent a long time thinking love had to look a certain way I began. Loud, visible, approved by everyone watching. But I learned something else. Real love doesn't need witnesses. It just needs truth. I used to think I had to prove my worth to earn my place. But today, standing here, I know that everything I needed was already inside me. I just had to stop apologizing for it. Daniel's eyes glistened. I saw Rachel wipe her face behind her camera. The wind carried my voice away over the cliff into the sea. Daniel took out his own vows, folded in half and worn at the edges. "I don't need promises," he said softly. "I just need you to keep doing what you've already done. Choose peace, even when noise seems easier. Choose yourself, and let me stand beside you while you do." The world went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Samantha lifted her camera just as the light shifted. The sun broke through a thin layer of cloud spilling across the terrace, and in that second I felt something release. My throat tightened and tears slipped down before I could stop them. But they weren't heavy tears. They were light like the air around us. Daniel reached up, brushing one from my cheek. "You made it," he whispered. "You're here." I smiled through the tears. "I am." The guitar faded out, replaced by the sound of waves crashing against rock below. We didn't need an officiant to tell us what to do next. Daniel leaned forward, and when our lips met, the guests clapped softly, their laughter carried by the wind. For a moment I saw the reflection of the sun in his eyes, and thought of Boston. Its marble halls, its flashbulbs, its carefully practiced smiles. The contrast was almost too sharp to believe. There, everything had been curated, posed framed. Here, everything just existed. Samantha snapped one more photo as Daniel and I turned toward the horizon. In it, the sunlight glowed around us like a halo, the sky bleeding into deep orange. Later, that image would find its way online, captioned with her words to those who showed up, to those who could. I stood there a long while after the laughter faded, the sea below burning with the last of the day. The light slid across the villa's white walls, climbing up the curve of the dome. I pressed my head against Daniel's shoulder and closed my eyes. The world was quiet, soft, alive. And I thought not with bitterness, but with peace that light always knows where to stay. 2 days after the wedding, we were back in Los Angeles. The house was full of laughter, leftover wine, and the kind of easy silence that comes when everyone you love fits in one room. Rachel and Jason were arguing about playlists. Adam was trying to light the outdoor candles, and Samantha sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her camera roll. She stopped suddenly, her face lit by the phone's glow. "This one," she said. "This is the one." It was the photo she'd taken right after our vows, me and Daniel standing at the edge of the terrace, the sun dipping low, the sea turning to gold. My hand rested against his chest, both of us laughing at something no one else could hear. It didn't look staged. It looked alive. Samantha typed a caption, "Simple quiet," to those who showed up. Within an hour, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Then mine joined in. Notifications flooded the screen. Shares, comments, tags. Someone had reposted it to a lifestyle account. Then a journalist from Vogue Weddings retweeted it with the headline, "The photo redefining modern love." Daniel looked at me over the rim of his glass. "You're going viral." "Mrs. Carter," I laughed. "For what?" "Having good lighting." He grinned. "For having peace. That's rarer." The next morning it was everywhere. News outlets ran the image side by side with the headline, "The Silent Bride Who Broke the Internet." The piece described the simplicity of our ceremony, calling it a quiet rebellion against the culture of spectacle. But the contrast came quickly. Another outlet published an article titled, "The Hamilton Gala, a Portrait of Excess." The story opened with a still frame from a video. My father handing an envelope to a journalist. The clip had been picked up by several independent reporters. Someone had slowed it down. Enhanced the audio. His voice was unmistakable. Just make sure the press writes something flattering. In Boston, they were watching the fallout unfold in real time. Olivia was sitting at the kitchen counter, her makeup half done, scrolling through the comments under her latest post. "Why is everyone turning this into a comparison?" she muttered. The screen was filled with side-by-side photos, her posing under a chandelier, me standing under a sunset. The captions were merciless. My mother stood nearby, pale. "It'll pass," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's not passing," Olivia said, throwing her phone onto the counter. "Sponsors are pulling out. The Hamiltons just called. They're freezing all future collaborations." Richard entered the room holding his phone to his ear. "I'm on the line with our attorney," he snapped. "We'll stop this before it gets worse." "What are you even stopping?" Olivia shot back. "The truth." He glared at her. "Watch your tone. This family doesn't implode in public." But it already was. The TV in the background played footage of the gala. The news anchor's voice was cool and deliberate. "Hamilton Estate is now facing allegations of misused grant funding. An anonymous source claims the event was intended to launder money through art sales." My father's hand trembled slightly as he set the phone down. "Find that reporter," he told my mother. "We'll sue them for defamation if we have to." In Los Angeles, I watched it all unfold quietly from our living room. The morning light streamed through the blinds, illuminating the phone in my hand. The photo, our photo, was still everywhere. I scrolled through the comments, hundreds of them. "This is what Grace looks like. Family over fame." She didn't clap back. She just lived better. Rachel sent a text. "Have you seen the news? #family over fame is trending." I typed back, "I have. Let it be." Daniel came up behind me, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You okay?" "I am," I said. It's strange. And I spent half my life wanting them to see me. Now they finally do, but not for the reasons I thought. He kissed my temple. "That's the point, isn't it? You didn't need to fight. The truth did the work for you." That evening we had dinner on the patio. The sky over Los Angeles turned pink, fading into indigo. My phone buzzed again. Another notification, another headline. I flipped it over, screen down. On the other side of the country in his office, my father sat staring at the same photo, the one of me and Daniel under the Santorini sun. The image filled the entire screen of his phone, the reflection of the light flickering across his face. Behind him, the room was dark. He didn't speak. He didn't curse. He just looked at it. And for the first time, the light that had followed him his entire life didn't seem to recognize him anymore. A week later, the entrance of Pierce Development looked like the front steps of a courthouse. Cameras lined the sidewalk, reporters shouting questions over the sound of idling vans. "Mr. Pierce, did you accept payments from the Hamilton Group? Is it true you used the Gala to cover illegal investments?" My father didn't answer. He just kept walking. Face stone-hard hand pressed against the door as security pushed back the crowd. The flash from the cameras washed over him, harsh and white. For the first time, he looked smaller than the image he'd built. Inside their home, Margaret sat on the couch, surrounded by folded newspapers. Her mascara smudged the tea on the table untouched. Olivia stood by the window phone in hand, scrolling through emails. "They're canceling everything," she said, her voice shaking. "The endorsements, the gallery exhibit, the interviews. Gone." Her mother tried to console her. "It's temporary. These things blow over." Olivia turned eyes red. "Do you really believe that—" "Look around, Mom. The only thing we ever sold was the idea of perfection." In Los Angeles, I watched the same story unfold on television. The anchor's tone was sharp, deliberate. Sources confirm the Department of Justice has opened an inquiry into Hamilton Estate's financial connections to the Pierce Development Group. Daniel muted the TV. "You want me to turn it off?" "No," I said. "It's fine." He studied me carefully. "How do you feel?" I took a slow breath, watching the muted screen. My father being ushered past reporters, my sister covering her face, my mother hiding from the camera. "I think they're finally learning what I learned years ago," I said. "That truth doesn't care how expensive your mask is." He reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. The next morning, my assistant buzzed me in my office. "Lauren, there's someone here asking for you." I looked up, surprised. "Who?" She hesitated. "He said his name is Richard Pierce." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Send him to the cafe down the street," I said. "Tell him I'll meet him there." The cafe was small, quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. When I walked in, he was already seated, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. He looked older, more lines around his eyes, his hair silvered at the edges. Still wearing the same kind of suit he'd worn to every event, as if the armor might still protect him. "Lauren," he said, standing halfway. Unsure whether to hug me. He didn't. "You look well." "Thank you," I said, sitting down. There was a long silence. The hiss of the espresso machine filled the space between us. I didn't come to argue. He began. "I came because I need you to understand something." I folded my hands. "Go on." "I've spent my life protecting this family's name. Everything I've done, every deal, every event. It was for the Pierces. To keep us respected. To make sure our name meant something." I looked him in the eye. "And it does. It means everything you chose over us." His expression faltered. "You don't understand what it takes to maintain a reputation in this city, maybe not," I said. "But I know what it costs." He stared at me, jaw tight. "I just wanted to keep the Pierce name alive." I leaned forward, voice steady. "And I just wanted to keep my soul." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. He picked up his coffee, took one sip and set it back down. His phone buzzed on the table. He hesitated, then glanced at the screen. I could see the name of his lawyer flashing across it. "Excuse me," he muttered, answering. "Yes." His tone changed instantly. Flat, cold. "What do you mean they've opened a full investigation?" "No, He stopped listening. The color drained from his face. When he finally hung up, his hand shook slightly as he set the phone down. For the first time I saw fear, not pride, in his eyes. He looked at me like a man realizing too late what he'd built his kingdom on. "I have to go," he said quietly. He stood fumbling for his wallet. I reached out and stopped him. "Don't," I said. "It's just coffee." He nodded once, eyes down, and walked out into the street. I stayed there staring at the chair he'd left empty. Outside, the sun filtered through the glass window, falling across my hands. The sound of the cafe returned, steam, chatter, the hum of normal life. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, no triumph, no need for anything more. Just a kind of quiet release. When you stop waiting for an apology, freedom finally has room to breathe. 1 month later, the news reached even the quiet corners of Santorini. I was sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee when the morning broadcast echoed from the small TV in the kitchen. "The Hamilton Group is officially under federal investigation for financial fraud," the anchor announced. Authorities confirmed that Richard Pierce has stepped down from the board of Pierce Development, citing ethical concerns. Olivia Pierce has deleted her social media accounts following backlash surrounding the Gala scandal. The screen flickered, images alternating between Boston and the Aegean. My father walking through a swarm of reporters, eyes straight ahead, mouth tight. No words this time. My mother sitting alone at the dining room table, reading the headlines on her tablet. Olivia closing her laptop, her face pale under studio lights that were no longer hers. I muted the TV. Outside, the sea was calm, glittering, as if it didn't care who fell or rose. Justice doesn't need my help. It comes when it's ready. My phone buzzed. Helen Baker's name appeared on the screen. She was my mother's older sister, a retired lawyer who had spent her life arguing for the kind of justice the courts often forgot. "Lauren," she said when I picked up, her voice low and warm. "I saw the news. Are you doing all right?" "I'm fine," I said. It's strange watching it happen from so far away. "That's the thing about justice," she said. "The law moves slowly, but sometimes life delivers its verdict first." Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. That afternoon, the sun dipped low, spilling gold across the walls. I was in the kitchen arranging flowers when I heard footsteps outside the villa. When I opened the door, my mother was standing there. She looked smaller, like the years had caught up to her all at once. "Hi, Mom," I said softly. She smiled faintly. "You look well." "Thanks. Do you want to come in?" She shook her head. "I won't stay long." In her hands was a small white envelope. "I wanted to give you this myself." I hesitated, then took it. The handwriting was familiar, delicate and slanted. I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter written in ink that had smudged in places. Your father doesn't know what love is, and somewhere along the way, I forgot. You were always the brave one. I'm sorry for letting you face everything alone. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know. I read it twice. The words felt heavy but not painful, just final. When I looked up, she was watching me. I didn't come for anything she said. I just wanted you to hear it once, from me. I nodded. Thank you for saying it. She reached out as if to touch my face, then thought better of it. He'll never admit he's wrong, she whispered. But that doesn't mean he doesn't feel it. I wanted to believe that. Maybe one day I would. Daniel came out onto the terrace, stopping when he saw us. My mother smiled politely. You have a good man, she said. I do. She nodded once more, then turned to leave. The wind lifted her hair as she walked down the path. She didn't look back. After she was gone, Daniel took the letter from my hands, reading it in silence. When he finished, he folded it neatly and handed it back. You won, he said quietly, but no one lost. The sky began to dim, the colors shifting from orange to violet. I stood near the edge of the terrace, holding the letter, the paper warm from my hands. Then I lit a match. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges of the paper until it turned to ash. The wind picked up, carrying the fragments into the open air, scattering them over the sea. Forgiveness doesn't need proof. It just needs release. That night the TV played a rerun of our wedding coverage. The same image that had started everything. Me and Daniel under the Santorini sunset, hand in hand, the light wrapping around us. At the bottom of the screen, a line of text appeared. When grace speaks, pride falls silent. I turned the volume down and watched until the screen faded to black, the reflection of the sea flickering across the glass like a heartbeat. 2 months later, the email came in the middle of a quiet morning. The subject line was simple. If you want to start again, I'll listen. It was from my father. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, reading the single sentence over and over. There was no greeting, no explanation, no apology, just that one line. I smiled faintly, not from forgiveness or bitterness, but from understanding. Some things, even if they arrive late, don't need to be answered. I closed my laptop and stepped outside. The air in Santorini carried that same familiar mix of salt and warmth. Daniel was waiting by the gate, 2 cups of coffee in hand. You look thoughtful, he said, handing me one. Email from my dad, I said. He raised an eyebrow. Good news or bad? Neither, I said, just overdue. We walked down to the beach. The waves were soft that morning, folding into the sand like they were trying not to wake anyone. I watched the water pull at my feet, the cold sting of it grounding me. Forgiveness isn't about going back. It's about walking forward without dragging the past behind you. That night we had dinner with friends on the roof terrace. The sky turned the color of copper before melting into navy. Candles flickered in the breeze, and the table was covered with plates of olives, roasted vegetables, and bottles of local wine. Laughter spilled over the edge of the terrace, carrying down toward the village. Rachel raised a glass. To peace, she said. The kind you don't have to explain. To peace, Daniel echoed, tapping his glass against mine. The night was warm, the kind that makes you forget time exists. Somewhere between dessert and silence, Daniel leaned close, his voice low enough for only me to hear. If they never apologize, he asked, will you be okay? I looked up at the stars, bright and unbothered. Karma doesn't need an apology, I said. It just needs time. He smiled like he always did when I said something that made him stop thinking for a second. Later that week, an unknown number called. The woman on the other end introduced herself as a producer for a documentary series. We'd love to feature your story, she said, her tone practiced, but eager. Family over fame. Have you heard of it? It's trending everywhere. You'd be perfect for it. We want your perspective. I paused, watching the sea out the window. The light was spilling across the terrace again, soft and golden like the day of the wedding. I appreciate that, I said finally, but that light doesn't need me anymore. There was a small silence on the line. Are you sure, she asked? It could reach millions. I already reached who I needed to, I said, and hung up. The next morning I sat across from my lawyer, a folder open between us. It was a contract, a personal branding deal worth several million an offer, to turn my story into a speaking tour, a lifestyle line, a book. All of it carefully polished and ready for the version of me the world wanted to consume. "Do you want me to negotiate terms?" he asked. I looked at the numbers. They meant nothing. No. I said, signing the line under decline. "Tell them thank you, but I'm choosing quiet." When he left, I walked back to the terrace. Daniel was sketching something in his notebook, the sound of waves mingling with the scratch of his pencil. I poured tea into a small cup and sat beside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The horizon glowed with the first colors of dusk gold giving way to deep rose. I set the cup down on the table and rested my chin on my hand, watching the sun dissolve into the sea. For the first time, the stillness didn't feel empty. It felt earned. 2 years later, the mornings in Santorini still felt new. The light poured through the windows like something alive, and every sound, the wind, the sea, even the distant bells from the harbor, seemed to remind me that peace could be a place, not just a feeling. The White Horizon Villa wasn't just a home anymore. It had become the headquarters of the Pierce Women's Initiative, a small but growing program I started for women who wanted to build something of their own. We held workshops on the terrace overlooking the Aegean. Sometimes the sea would drown out the sound of our voices, but that never bothered me. What mattered was that they were speaking. Out loud, without apology. That morning, a group of 6 young women gathered around the long wooden table. They were from all over. New York, Lisbon, Seoul. Some were building tech startups, others wanted to open bakeries or design firms. I poured coffee into their cups, the smell of cinnamon drifting through the air. One of them, a girl named Anna, looked nervous. "What if no one believes in you?" she asked. "What if you're the only one who sees it?" I smiled, remembering my own nights staring at a screen in that tiny apartment in Los Angeles. "Then you start with that one person," I said, "because sometimes believing in yourself is what makes others notice." They nodded, writing in their notebooks. For a moment, I watched them quietly. Their energy, their fire, the way they were all trying to build something bigger than what they'd been told was possible. When the session ended, they lingered, laughing, taking photos by the balcony. As the last of them left, Anna turned back and said, "Thank you for trusting us before the world does." I stood there long after they'd gone, the sound of their footsteps fading down the hill. When my parents left, I thought I'd lost everything. But that day I understood I'd just begun. Daniel came out from his studio with his camera slung around his neck. "You looked like you were teaching a master class out here," he said. "Not teaching," I said. "Just reminding." He raised the camera. "Don't move." The shutter clicked as the wind caught my scarf, lifting it into the sunlight. The fabric danced against the sky, white against blue, a blur of motion and stillness. "Got it," he said, lowering the camera. "You look happy." "I am," I said simply. Inside, my laptop chimed with a new notification. I opened it to find an article from a business magazine, "The Woman Who Redefined Family." The cover photo was the same one Daniel had taken that morning, my scarf frozen midair, the ocean blazing behind me. I scrolled through the piece. It talked about Vital Track, about the initiative, about the quiet success that followed scandal. But what caught my eye was the final line. "Sometimes the loudest legacy is grace." I closed the laptop, walked back outside, and leaned against the terrace railing. The sea below shimmered endless and certain. The light touched everything. Soft, golden, forgiving. I thought of my father, wherever he was now. Of my mother, perhaps finally breathing without performance. Of Olivia, who had started painting again quietly under a different name. My story didn't need their approval anymore. It had found its own reflection in the women I mentored, in the life I built, in the silence that finally felt like home. The breeze picked up warm and steady. I could taste the salt in the air. Daniel called from inside, asking if I wanted tea. "In a minute," I said. For a long time, I just stood there watching the horizon blur into light. My silence had said enough. The screen fades to black. And if you believe in the strength of quiet things, if you've ever found peace after the noise, then maybe your story is just waiting for its light too.